Welcome to the Integrating Angular with Node.js RESTful Services course. My name is Dan Wallin, and I'm a software developer and trainer specializing in web technologies. I work a lot with Angular and different server-side technologies, so I'm really excited to introduce this course. Now, throughout the course, you'll see firsthand how Angular and Node.js can be used to build an application that allows users to view customer data, page through it, and then perform insert, update, and delete operations. This includes learning how to move data from a database all the way down to an Angular client using RESTful services. As data is modified in the client, you're also going to learn different techniques for sending that data to the service so it can be stored in the database. On the server side, you'll learn about Node.js and Express and how they can be used to define RESTful endpoints. You'll also examine how Angular services and the HTTP client can be used to make async calls to the RESTful service and retrieve data. You'll see how components can subscribe to observables and render data in the user interface using child components. This includes discussing input and output properties and how they can be used to pass data in and out of components. The course will also discuss different form techniques, including template-driven forms and reactive forms, and highlight the differences between them. So let's get started and jump right in. Let's start things off by talking about the overall goals of this course, some of the key technologies we'll learn about, and the sample application that we're going to walk through. So the first thing I'll do is walk you through the prereqs that you need to know so you can maximize the learning process and get through this course and feel like you got something out of it as well. We'll talk about the overall learning goals and what you can expect right up front. And then we're going to clarify some of the key server-side technologies and concepts that we'll be covering, as well as the client-side technologies and concepts. So that'll include things like RESTful services, what that means, observables in Angular, and more. From there, we'll talk about how to get the sample application that we're going to be building up and running locally on your machine, and I'm also going to show you how you can get it up and running using something called Docker. So let's jump right in. Let's take a quick look at the prerequisite knowledge you need to have to maximize your learning as you watch this course. Throughout the course, we're going to be using JavaScript and TypeScript a lot, so you should be very comfortable working with those two languages. On the server side, we'll work mainly with JavaScript, but when we get to the Angular code, we're going to be using TypeScript. You'll also want to be comfortable with Angular fundamentals, so knowing about components, services, how those work with providers and modules will be very helpful. So if you're new to Angular or some of the languages, definitely take the time to watch some of the other introductory level courses that are on pluralsight.com. Finally, you'll also want to have at least a basic knowledge of how Node.js works, since we're going to be using that to create a RESTful service and integrate with a database. There's also courses on pluralsight.com that will cover that topic as well, if you need a little bit of material there to get you up to speed. If you feel comfortable with these three different areas, then let's move ahead and jump into more specifics about the learning goals in this course.
सर ये अब सोचने का नजरिया चेंज करना पड़ेगा।
जो वाइगेटेरियल सिक्योरिटी ये होती है कि जो रूट चलते हैं रूट भी चेकिंग होती है, दो गाड़ी तो आगे चलती है।
Before jumping into a book or a video course, I always like to know more about what I'm going to learn. So let's take a quick look at the overall learning goals I have for you as you go through this course. So first off, we're going to be focusing on two main areas and how we can integrate these together. We're going to talk about client-side technologies, and then we'll talk about server-side technologies. So we'll be talking about Angular on the client side, and then integrating that with Node.js, of course, on the server side, and building a RESTful service that integrates with a database, which will be MongoDB in this particular application we'll be discussing. So the overall server-side learning goals include understanding how Node.js and Express can be used to create a RESTful service. We're also going to talk about something I call convention-based routes. Now, this is not a normal way to build Express routes. It's something custom that I like to do that I think really cleans up the amount of code you write. So I'll show you a little bit of customization you can do. We'll also talk about how you can expose RESTful endpoints using Express, and how we can write some reusable code and build some library type code that can be used to integrate with one or more different databases. In this particular case, we'll be using MongoDB. Now on the client side, we're going to be looking at Angular and how we can use the HTTP client to integrate with the Node.js RESTful service. Now technically, we could call any type of RESTful service, but for the sample application we'll be running, it'll be based on Node.js as mentioned. So we'll look at the role of RxJS and observables and see how observables play a big role in the asynchronous calls we're going to make to a RESTful service. We're going to use the HTTP client to call different functions that can be used to interact with the RESTful service. We're going to be making AJAX calls, or technically XHR, XML HTTP requests to the server. We'll also see how we can perform complete CRUD operations, create, read, update, delete, so that we can insert, update, and delete data, ultimately in the target database. And then finally, we'll also learn how we can page data in the application and how the server side is going to play a role in that, and how the client side can then render that page data. So that's a quick look at the overall learning goals. From here, let's jump into some of the key technologies and the concepts you're going to need to know on the server side and the client side. In this section, we're going to take a quick look at the key server-side technologies and concepts that you need to know. That way, when we jump into the code a little bit later in the course, you'll already have some clarity on the concepts that we'll be talking about there. So we're going to be using Node.js and MongoDB on the server side, and we'll be building some RESTful services, of course, in Node.js. We'll also be building some modules that are reusable for MongoDB that can be used to perform CRUD operations, create, read, update, and delete against MongoDB. Now, when it comes to the RESTful services, we're going to be embracing very heavily HTTP concepts and using those, and that will be used to ultimately build our RESTful services. Now, if you're new to the concept of REST, let's talk about what that is, at least from a high level. It stands for Representational State Transfer. And I know for me personally, the first time I heard it, I went, okay, that doesn't tell me a lot. Well, really what it's all about is we want to transfer state data between one type of client up to the server in our particular case. That means we want to go from Angular and transfer some data up to Node, or we want to request from Node some data that we want to get back into Angular. Now, REST itself is a pretty high-level architectural concept or style that's used to build distributed systems. Now, we're going to use Angular 2 in the browser throughout this course, but technically, I can make this work on mobile devices. It could be something for iOS or Android or whatever it may be. And that's really the importance and why RESTful services are so popular these days, because really any type of client can integrate with them, as long as they support HTTP concepts. So we're going to expose different resources, and really resources are the state or the data that the clients want to get to or send up to the RESTful service. And we're going to use a URI or URL, so a Uniform Resource Identifier, or just a standard URL that we're all used to, a link, to identify these resources. And that's what really makes RESTful services pretty neat, is because as long as you use standard HTTP concepts, which we'll be doing, anything out there that understands HTTP can interact with these types of services. It could be something as simple as a Raspberry Pi all the way up to a fully functional single-page application that's built in Angular. So that means we'll be using HTTP, URIs, and also MIME types. MIME types are the underlying string that's passed back and forth to say what is the client sending up to the server and what is the server sending back. It could be HTML, it could be XML, or in our case, it's mainly going to be JSON, JavaScript Object Notation type of data. Now, from a really high level, let's look at what a RESTful type of system looks like. Now, we've all called in to some type of a phone number service. And some of those call-ins, you go through what feels like 10,000 different options to finally get to talk to someone. With a RESTful service, we expose the resource we want to get to directly. That means we can call 1-800-GOLD, for instance. If we're a Gold customer service type level and want to talk directly to the Gold desk. If we were on the Silver side of things, this would relate to, hotel type of systems or airline where you have different statuses. Maybe we want to do 1-800-SILVER to expose the direct Silver line and allow us to get support for that type of thing. And then finally, any customers that really don't use the service very much, they just call the standard number and they can get directly to the standard resource. Now, what does this have to do with RESTful services, you might ask? We can see that we're exposing a resource by giving it something unique, a unique URI. Now, in this case, it's more of a unique phone number, but in just a moment, I'll translate this over to URIs and we'll see how that works. So now we can simply call 1-800-GOLD, 1-800-SILVER, 1-800-STANDARD, and get direct to that resource. We're not having to get routed through all kinds of different options that we might have to select from. Now let's convert this over then to more of a RESTful service type of concept in URIs. So instead of a phone number, we might go to /order/gold, and that gets us to some gold type of resource, or /order/silver to get to the silver one, or order/standard to get to the standard type of resource. Now the resource in this case is going to be the data that we're either sending up to the server or getting back, and that's where the RESTful service becomes a very novel type of way actually to expose data. That's why a lot of the different popular social media sites out there use RESTful services, because again, the clients in this case, the Gold, Silver, and regular customers, they could be anything. They could be a phone, they could be a desktop browser, they could be a Raspberry Pi or something in the IoT type of world. As long as we're able to embrace HTTP and this URI concept, we can get to a specific resource and share that data. Now, the key technology players that we're going to be discussing throughout the course include Angular, Node.js, and MongoDB. So really what we're after is we want to make a RESTful service that's capable of integrating with MongoDB and returning data to Angular. Angular may then update that data and then send it back to the RESTful service so that we can put it back in the database. So it kind of looks like this. We might do a GET request, and that would allow the data to flow all the way down to Angular. It may then change that data in some way, shape, or form. In this case, we just changed the name. And then that data is going to flow back up to the RESTful service built in Node and Express. And then that will take care of calling some library type code that can do, for instance, an update into MongoDB. And that's really what we're after here as we build the application and work with the server-side code.
बात तो सही है
लेकिन बस एंगुलर पे ही क्यों नहीं कर रहे हो कि तुमको सर ये चाहिए वो चाहिए आप पता है फिर कहोगे लास्ट में कहोगे एक्चुअली ना अभी ना फ्लटर आया नया हम पूरा भटक गए थे एंगुलर पे चले गए थे फ्लटर करते हैं
नहीं देखो एंगुलर में हमारा क्या कि हम काम करते आ रहे हैं
On the client side of the application, we're going to be using several different technologies and concepts as well. But I want to go over from a high level so that again, once we jump into the code later, you'll already have that foundation in place to understand what we're doing. So first off, we're going to be using Angular, and then we're also going to be using another library that Angular relies on quite heavily called RxJS, or Reactive Extensions for JavaScript. Now, by using Angular functionality, we're going to be able to make XHR HTTP calls up to the Node.js Express RESTful service. And then as you saw, that'll integrate with MongoDB to allow us to get data and do things like inserts and updates and deletes of data. Now, as the data is going back and forth, and we're making these asynchronous calls from Angular 2, though, we're also going to be using something that's part of RxJS called observables. So you're going to learn about how to import RxJS functionality, what observables are here, and what they're all about. So let's first talk about what is RxJS. Well, RxJS, or Reactive Extensions for JavaScript, see a link down here on the bottom left, is really a library. So it's just some JavaScript code that you can import into your Angular apps and then use it to build these asynchronous event-based type of programs. Now, because we're going to be making AJAX calls, or what a lot of people would just call HTTP calls, up to the RESTful service, we're of course going to have a lot of asynchronous type of code going on. And RxJS provides some really, really interesting and powerful functionality for working with these asynchronous operations. Now, we're going to be talking about something called observables and observable sequences. This is something that RxJS makes very easy to work with, and I'll talk more about that in just a moment. But the bottom line is, this is what Angular uses out of the box. And so as we're making the calls up to the RESTful service, we're getting data back, we're going to need to work with these observable sequences of data. Now let's talk more about what I mean then by observable sequences and asynchronous operations, and even other options you might have already heard of or used in the past. The number one asynchronous operation that most JavaScript programmers know about is promises. Now, you can use promises in Angular, but it's not the default option, as you're going to see. In a nutshell, a promise is a way to work with an asynchronous operation that hasn't completed, but you know it's going to come back to you with some data sometime in the future. And so we call this async deferred operations. The browser makes a call up to the RESTful service, but we don't want to lock up the browser, of course. So we do that call behind the scenes, and then eventually it comes back, and some type of callback function is called, and we have to write the code to hook up to that callback function. And this is what, as I mentioned, most JavaScript programs have done with asynchronous operations in jQuery, Angular 1, and many other libraries and frameworks that are out there, actually. Now, an observable is actually a little bit different. If you've ever heard of the publish-subscribe type of model, or something called the observer pattern, this is the process of having an object that we can subscribe to, and this object is going to return different data over time. And as that data changes, we subscribe to it, and we instantly know, oh, okay, new data just came in. So really, this is all about returning multiple values over time. Now, the difference between this and promises I'll make a little more clear as we move along here, but in a nutshell, a promise allows one piece of data to come back. An observable could have multiple pieces of data coming back over time. And so this is more of an event-based type of technique that we can work with. Now let's look at the differences between these two asynchronous options, because I know for me personally, I was much more comfortable with promises than I was with observables and RxJS concepts. So let's start with promises. Promises have been around for quite a while now, and as mentioned, they allow us to handle asynchronous operations in the browser. Let's say we have an Angular component and it calls up to an Angular service, and that service may make an HTTP call up to a Node.js RESTful service. So in order for that to work, we would have to call up from Angular the component. And then we don't know when that data is going to come back, so we would be returned a promise. And then we would hook this promise into a callback function. Now, eventually, the server returns data to the Angular service, and then that data would flow down into the Angular component, and then we're done. So a promise only returns one piece of data over time, but it's a great way to work with asynchronous calls, and that's what most of us have used over.
क्या होता है यूट्यूब पे गाय पे भी इन पे ये ऑनलाइन ट्यूटर रहते हैं, इन पे डाला रहता है कि 20 दिन का कोर्स है, इसका सीख लो, 30 दिन में पाइथन सीख लो। तो ये सीख लो मतलब क्या है? ये आपने उसको पढ़ा, आपने उसके सिंटैक्स समझ लिया या रट लिए? मुझे ऐसा लगता है
यही चक्कर तुम्हारा 3.5 साल वेस्ट हुआ है, और अगर नहीं सुधरे तो 3.5 साल फिर वेस्ट होगा, और उसमें आईटी तो नामुमकिन है। और जो हरकत बस कर रहा है,
अबे हमारे एक ही है, हम कई दिन से एंगुलर पढ़ रहे हैं
और तो नहीं पढ़ रहे, तो तुम सारे पाइथन कोड का रिकॉर्ड करा रहे हो वीडियो।
अब तो रिकॉर्ड करा कर
हम दे देंगे, चलो तुम जॉब ले लो, हम दे देंगे 2000 रुपया।
नहीं,
2000 रुपया थोड़ी कुछ हो जाएगा।
रिकॉर्ड हम करा रहे हैं कि हमारा
सब्सक्रिप्शन ले लेना 2000 रुपये का।
An observable could have multiple pieces of data coming back over time. And so this is more of an event-based type of technique that we can work with. Now let's look at the differences between these two asynchronous options, because I know for me personally, I was much more comfortable with promises than I was with observables and RxJS concepts. So let's start with promises. Promises have been around for quite a while now, and as mentioned, they allow us to handle asynchronous operations in the browser. So let's say we have an Angular component and it calls up to an Angular service, and that service may make an HTTP call up to a Node.js RESTful service. So in order for that to work, we would have to call up from Angular the component. And then we don't know when that data is going to come back, so we would be returned a promise. And then we would hook this promise into a callback function. Now eventually the server returns data to the Angular service, and then that data would flow down into the Angular component, and then we're done. So a promise only returns one piece of data over time, but it's a great way to work with asynchronous calls, and that's what most of us have used over the years. Now observables are quite a bit different, so let's take a look at them. Let's say again we have an Angular component and an Angular service, but the service function that we're hooking up to returns something called an observable instead of a promise. So what we can do is we can subscribe to some type of object that can be returning data over time. So for example, we might have a random number generator in the Angular service that just every 5 seconds or something returns random data back to the Angular component. Now to make this possible, we don't have to hook a promise up to a callback function every time we expect a new random piece of data to come back. In this case, we have maybe a timer in the Angular service. So as mentioned, all we do is subscribe to the observable that's going to be returned from an Angular service function. And then let's say that random data fires every 5 seconds. Well, we can get this data over time dumped into our Angular component callback function. Now this is like hooking up to a pipe that you really don't know when the pipe's going to stop dumping data out to you. Maybe you have just a basket at the bottom of the pipe. And in this case, the basket would be the Angular component callback function, and then the pipe would be the observable that's returned from the Angular service. By subscribing to this, we get data over time. Now let me throw one more feature in that we could use this for. With HTTP, you only get back one piece of data. It's request, and then you get the response. So you might say, why not just use a promise there? And the answer is, you could. But the default in Angular is observables, mainly for consistency, because there's a lot of other areas in Angular that use this as well. Routing, for instance, uses observables. So what we can do is hook up to the function that returns the observable and get back that one HTTP value. But let's say that the server was actually a WebSocket server. Now, if you're not familiar with that, a WebSocket server can return data or push it from the server down to the browser over time. So let's say we have stock quotes, for instance, that over time we want to subscribe to. The server then, as the data changes on the server side, pushes those down to the Angular service. The observable gets those changes, the pipe, and then that data can start flowing in over time from the service. And with an observable, we only have to subscribe to that once, and we just continue to get this stream of data over time. Whereas with a promise, we get one piece of data, then have to rehook up, and it would actually be a lot more challenging to do that. So here's a quick comparison to review the two concepts. Promises return a single value, and you can't cancel it. Once you hook up to a promise, you can either get the data back or you can get an error back. Now, you could choose to ignore the data, but you can't really cancel a promise per se. Now, one of the nice things about them, they are natively supported in browsers. So if you have a modern browser, you can use promises directly, but even older browsers can work well with promises because there's libraries like Q that can be used. Now, observables, on the other hand, can return a stream of data, multiple values, over time. So a random number generator, a WebSocket scenario, or even just one piece of data that comes with an HTTP call to the server. Now, what's nice about these is once you subscribe, anytime you want to stop getting a stream of data, you can just unhook it. You can cancel it, unsubscribe. And that's a nice feature. So maybe you are hooked up to a WebSocket scenario where the server's pushing data. And maybe after 10 minutes, the client has all they need. So you say, I'm done. I want to unhook. Well, that's like detaching from the pipeline. Now the server might push it to some other clients, but your client then could stop receiving that data. Now this means that when you work with observables, because we're getting an array of data over time, you can work with standard array functions that you might have used before, like map or filter or reduce, and we'll see a few of these as we move along later in the code. Now observables are not built into the browser though. This is something that we need another library, a little helper that can help us out, and that's why Angular 2 doesn't have this built in. It actually relies on the RxJS library. So if you're new to that, we're going to talk about later, once we get to the code, how we can import RxJS functionality, work with operators, and more, so that we can subscribe to these observables and then use them to communicate ultimately with our service. Now that you've seen the technologies and concepts that we're going to be learning about throughout the course, let's jump into the sample application that's going to be using these technologies and putting all the concepts together. So what I'm going to demonstrate is how we can get the app up and running. Now before I do that, let's talk about the software requirements and the different things you're going to need to install if you want to get the app running locally. So first off, you can use any editor you'd like. I'm going to be using a free one that works on Windows, Mac, and Linux called VS Code. You can get it from code.visualstudio.com. But technically you can use whatever editor you'd like to get through the course. Doesn't really matter, but this is what I'll be using and what you'll be seeing throughout the videos. Now regardless if you're going to be running the app locally or through another option I'll be talking about later called Docker, you will need to install Node.js 6.5 or higher on your machine. And you can get this from nodejs.org. So if you already have it and you have the appropriate version, great. If not, go ahead and go to this site. And if you need any help with the installation, they have some walkthroughs there. Now the reason we need a 6.5 or higher edition of this is I'm going to be using some ES 2015 features, some more modern JavaScript features in some of the Node code that we're going to be running. Now the final thing we'll need is MongoDB. Now this also can run like Node and VS Code on all the operating systems, Mac, Windows, or Linux anyway. And the installation for this definitely depends on your operating system. So if you head to the doc link that I have here for you, you'll see some tutorials that will walk you through step by step getting this up and running. Now once you have that up and running, you can run the sample app. So let's take a look at how we can get started doing that. So if you open the application itself, you'll see the project code. I'm going to be talking about the folder structure and the various files a little bit later in the course. For now, we're just going to open the README Markdown file and walk through the running the application locally steps. Now you'll see the first step shows how we can use Node and Mongo and has the same links for you. But the next one is we need to run a MongoD command from the command line. So I'm going to right click at the bottom here in VS Code and say open in terminal. Now if you're on a Windows machine, you'll see open in a command prompt type of option. So I'm going to go ahead and open that, and this takes me to the root of the project. And now I'm going to try to run this MongoD command. Now I have this command set up so it's in my environment path. So I can type it from anywhere, any command terminal window, and it'll run. So if you run this and get an error like the program's not found or something, probably means it's not in your environment path. So I'd recommend go back to the MongoDB docs if you need any help there. But I'm going to go ahead and start mine up. You'll see it's pretty quick and easy. So now it's up and running. So that's kind of the first step there. Now next thing we're going to do, we're going to install some global Node.js dependencies. node1, the first one here, is going to be a Node.js module that'll monitor any changes to code. And when it detects that a file changes, it'll automatically stop and restart the node process. So it's really, really nice during development, so you don't have to keep starting and stopping your command window. Gulp is a JavaScript task manager. We're going to be using that to copy some Angular scripts into a static file folder called public that we'll also talk about later. So I'm going to go ahead and run this command to get these installed. And I have it set up so I can do multiple terminal windows through a kind of tabbed interface. If you don't have that, just open up a different command prompt terminal window and you'll be good to go. So we'll go ahead and run this. Now as you run these different install type commands, you're going to see some warnings and maybe some deprecated notices. You can ignore those. As long as you get this kind of tree view structure at the end, you should be good to go. All right, so now that we have that, let's move on to the next step. And we need to install the actual application dependencies. Now, these are all listed in a package.json file. And so all we're going to do is fire up npm install, or you can do npm I. And this will take a little bit of time to install, so through the magic of video, I'll wait till it finishes and meet you on the other side. All right, so it looks like that's all installed, and we're ready to go there, so we're really close to getting the app up and running now. So now we need to copy some Angular scripts that are here in the Node Modules folder that was just installed into our public static files folder, and have a lib folder we're going to copy those to. So we're going to run this gulp command to automate that task. And this will run really fast and copy those in. All right, we're good to go there. So the last thing we're going to run, if you go back to the README, is npm start. And this is going to actually start up the Node.js server, start up the RESTful service, and allow Angular scripts and the web pages and things to be served up. So let's go ahead and start that. Now the first time you run it, you'll see some data is going to be inserted. Looks like nodemon caught some changes and restarted the server for us, and then it says we should go to this localhost 3000. So we'll go ahead and do that. So let me open this up, run off here, and there we go. Now the application that we're going to be discussing throughout the course is all about integrating Angular with a Node.js Express RESTful service. And so I'll be building out those different pieces with you as we go through the course to do GET requests and put and post and delete, and we'll do paging and things like that. But before we dive into those details, let's just look at what the app does. First off, it displays customers by doing a GET request to the RESTful service. You can also sort. This is a local sort. We can also filter, so I could go find Bell, for instance. And then we can also edit the customers. So we can come in and select Michelle Avery. Maybe I'll change that to a 2 on first and last name. Update. And that just pushed that data up to the service, which then updated MongoDB. And of course we can go back, take that out, and you can see everything works as you'd expect. We can also add a new customer. So I can come on in and we'll do a real sophisticated one here with my favorite test data. All right, now you won't see that customer here because you'll notice there's also paging built into the app, which we'll also be talking about. So I'm going to go to the last page. Everything's sorted by default by last name to start off. And there we go. There's our test. So let's click on it. And then the last thing was we can also do delete requests. So I'll say delete and yes. Now if we go back to the last page, you'll see it's gone. So that's the sample application that we're going to be building throughout the course to show you how we can integrate Angular, RxJS, observables, services, and more with Node.js, Express, and RESTful services that are capable of integrating and doing CRUD operations with MongoDB. If you'd like to run the application using Docker containers, I have that available for you as well in the sample code. So I'm going to do a real quick run through of how to do that, the software installation requirements, and those type of things. Now I want to emphasize this is really intended for people who are already very comfortable with Docker. So if you're not, you can certainly skip this section and just go with the local install that's already been covered. But if you are interested in getting a Docker container up and running for Node.js and MongoDB, I'll walk you through those steps here and some of the basics. Now, as far as the software installation requirements, you'll still need a local editor, of course, so I'll be using VS Code for that. And you still are going to need Node.js because we're going to be using that for some of the dev type tools to run npm install, gulp, and things like that. Now, MongoDB and the actual Node server, the RESTful service, those are both going to run in Docker containers, though. So those won't actually be running on your local system. They'll be running in Docker containers. So, of course, to do that, you'll have to install Docker. Now, you can do Docker for Mac. There's Docker for Windows if you have Windows 10 Professional or higher. Or if you don't, you can look at Docker Toolbox. And then you can even get Docker going on Linux as well if you'd like. So let's jump into the application itself, and I'll show you the steps to get this going. So again, I've opened the README that we've seen earlier in this module. And in this running the application with Docker section, I'm going to walk through the steps real quick. Now, I've already installed a lot of the dependencies to speed this up for you. But the first thing we're going to do is, once we've installed Node locally in either Docker for Mac, Docker for Windows, or Docker Toolbox as appropriate, then we're going to come into our development file here. So I'm going to come into config development. And this is localhost by default, since we'll be hitting the local version of Mongo. But we want to hit MongoDB in a Docker container. We're going to name that MongoDB. So that's why the host is going to change here. So once you've saved that file, we can move on to the next step. Next thing is we'll have to install Gulp. So we'll come on into our terminal window, and we'll run the global install of that. I already have it, so it should be pretty quick here. And this again is going to be used to copy our Angular scripts into our public static files folder. We'll be using those in just a bit here. Next thing we'll do is our package.json has all the Angular scripts, the node, and everything we need. So we need that node modules folder. Now I've already run this, but I'll run through it really fast. So we'll do npm install. That normally would take maybe a little bit of time, and then we're ready to go there. Now we'll also need to run the gulp copy libs to get the scripts from the node modules folder into the public static file folder. I showed this in the previous clip, so I'm not going to run it here, but just copy and paste that command there into the command window and run it, and that'll get the scripts copied. Now, next thing is we're going to be working with code locally, but it's actually going to be running up in a Docker Node.js container. So what I'm going to be doing is linking the Docker container back to our local machine folder using something called a volume. And that means we have to get everything ready locally so we can link back to our source code for this. The compilation step for our TypeScript code for the Angular 2 app. So we'll run that, and this one I'm going to leave up. This will sit there and watch for changes that we might make as we go through and modify the app at all. Now, the next step is we're now ready to run our Docker. So I'm on a Mac in this particular example, and you can see I have the Docker whale up here. If you're on Windows, it'll be down here in the right corner in your tray area. And that's for Docker for Mac or Docker for Windows. If you're doing Docker Toolbox, it's a little different, but hit docker.com and you can get more details on that. If you're on something like Windows 7 or Windows 8, they have a nice walkthrough for you. So I already have Docker running, so I just have to run this build command. Now this is going to get the node and the MongoDB Docker images available and ready. Now I've already downloaded these local, so this should go pretty fast, but it's going to build our node image. The MongoDB image I didn't need to modify, so it's just going to pull that from Docker Hub. All right, and this is already done because I had run it earlier. Now the last step is we need to run Docker compose up, and that's going to start the Node.js RESTful service in a container and link that over to a MongoDB Docker container so they can communicate. But the Node.js container itself is going to link back to our source code using this thing called a volume. So I'm going to go ahead and try to start this up. That's going to create the containers. What's really nice about this, if you haven't done Docker before, is I literally don't have MongoDB installed locally on my machine. It's in a container that I could easily stop and then delete the image, and it's just gone. So if you're interested in more details, check out my Docker for Web Developers course, which is also on pluralsight.com. But now that we've done that, we can run on back. Let's go to localhost 3000, and there we go. So we'll see the same app. I can edit customers, do all that type of stuff. See, that all works. Looks like everything's working well. And then when we're done, we can actually go back, and I'm just going to do Control C here to stop everything. And then I'm going to say Docker compose down. And that's going to stop those two containers. And now those are done. And then I could go to Docker images if I want to see the different images. There's the node image. There's the Mongo. So I could actually delete those if I wanted to. And it'd be as if they were never on my machine. So that would be an example of how you can use Docker if you'd like to work with this sample application. And it's a great way to go if you don't want to have to install all these servers on your local machine. In this introductory module, we set the stage for the overall learning goals that I have for you as you walk through this course. And really the overall goal is I want to show how we can integrate Angular 2 with Node.js RESTful services and also talk to an actual database. So as we start moving along in the upcoming modules, we're going to see that process. We also learned about some of the key technologies and concepts on both the server side and the client side. So on the server side, we talked about Node, MongoDB, HTTP and RESTful services being used. And then, of course, on the client side, we have Angular, RxJS, observables, and HTTP AJAX type calls. They're going to be made up to those RESTful services. We also took a look at the sample application and saw how you can run it locally or using Docker containers. So now it's time to jump into the actual application and start building some of the different pieces that allow us to integrate Angular with Node.js RESTful services. In this module, we're going to take a moment to explore the Node.js and Angular application and look at things like the project structure, how Node.js and Angular modules work and how they're configured, and even explore some other aspects of Angular such as modules, components, and services. So if you're already very comfortable with how Node.js modules work and how Angular modules work, you can certainly go through this module, maybe skim it, and jump right to the next one. But if you are new at all to some of the concepts we're going to cover, I would definitely recommend that you take a moment to go through it because I'm just going to provide a quick overview of how everything's put together. And that way, in the next module, when we start building out the code, you'll understand the base behind the application that's making it possible to run. So in this module, here's what we're going to cover. We're going to talk about the project structure first off. And I'm just going to walk through some of the key files, some of the folders, so you know the lay of the land, if you will. From there, we're going to talk about the Node.js and Angular modules that are needed, and just a quick overview of how they're used in the app. I have kind of a unique way of configuring my Express Node.js routes, so we're going to talk about a convention-based routing technique that can be used. We'll also go into the fundamentals of ES6 module loaders. In this particular application, I'll be using System.js. There are many options out there, though. So I'm going to go through how System.js is configured, make sure that you understand how it's all working under the covers. And then finally, we're going to create the basic building blocks that are going to be used later in the course as we start building out our GET and PUT and POST requests and things to the RESTful service. So I'm going to show an Angular module, a component, and a service, and I'll show you the fundamentals of how all that works together if you're new to that at all. So let's go ahead and get started by jumping into the project structure and walking through what it has as far as folders and files.
आप सीन में क्या करेंगे इसमें
5 order status.
Let's take a quick look at some of the different files and folders that make up the overall project structure of the app that we'll be discussing throughout the course. So I've opened the application up in my VS Code